I think it was probably the strongest picture I've made. I think it's my favorite film. Because what it does is it epitomizes everything I tried to say in all the other films in one package.
After more than 70 years, Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life is still widely regarded as a holiday favorite and one of the greatest films of all time. The film stars James Stewart as George Bailey, a citizen of the small town Bedford Falls who, in the beginning of the film, appears to be in desperate need of divine intervention, which comes to him in the form of Clarence, an angel seeking to earn his wings. But before intervening in George's life, Clarence first dives into George's past and in doing so guides us, the audience, through his life to discover what led him into this dire predicament. We learn that from a young age, George dreamed of a life of great adventure.
I'm going out exploring someday. You watch.
I'm shaking the dust of this crummy little town off my feet and I'm gonna see the world.
But as he grows older, his sense of responsibility to his community seems to prevent him from acting on his ambitions. I think a lot of us can relate to this seemingly eternal struggle between chasing our dreams and serving the needs of others, between having the feeling of limitless potential and finding it challenged by external limitations. What I find so interesting about this is that this idea of the individual versus the community is a relatively new concept. It wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that Emil Durkheim, one of the first modern sociologists, started observing what he called a religion of individualism, a growing focus on individual autonomy as the basis of modern society. Today, I want to dig deeper into this development of individualism and how it presents itself in Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life. Not only to explore why it's still such a beloved film, but also why it might be more relevant than ever. German sociologist Ulrich Beck wrote that for a long time the individual was but the smallest unit of an imagined whole. Individual behavior was even seen as deviant and idiotic throughout ancient times and much of the Middle Ages. Stories of great achievements and heroic journeys, as famously conceptualized by Joseph Campbell in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, were only reserved for a select few who were often predestined for greatness.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
What's this?
If we take a few examples of popular stories that were based on this hero's journey, we can see that the main protagonists indeed seem to have been fated from birth to one day fulfill a greater destiny. In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker's heritage and connection to the Force already set the stage for his heroic journey, just as Harry Potter's past set him up for his.
You're a wizard, Harry.
I'm a what?
In both cases, our protagonists were destined to become more than their fellow human beings. The upside of this for everyone else in these stories, let's say the settlers on Tatooine or the Muggles in England, is that they didn't have to worry about these grand matters. It is clear from the beginning, both to them and to us, that they would merely play small parts in the larger narrative. In our modern times, however, Joseph Campbell observed a change in the way we interpret the hero's journey. The growing focus on the individual and the crumbling of many of the grand narratives that used to determine the few worthy of a heroic journey resulted in us becoming the main heroes of our own stories. Each of us born into life with the expectation of a great adventure waiting for us.
Spending all your life trying to figure out how to save 3 cents in a length of pipe, I go crazy. I want to do something big and something important.
Ulrich Beck too notes that today there doesn't seem to be any desire more widespread than the desire to live one's own life. He writes, anyone who today travels in Europe and, needless to say, the United States, though also in South America, Singapore, Tokyo or South Korea, and asks what motivates people, what they strive for, what they struggle for, what is really important to them, receives the answers: money, jobs, power, love, God, etc., but also increasingly the promises of individualism. Money means one's own money, space means one's own space as elementary preconditions for a life of one's own. All of this of course seems pretty enticing, which is probably why it won't be a surprise that after the Second World War the rise of neoliberal economic policies embraced individualism and increasingly began to assume individuals as self-reliant and independent, capable of forging their own destiny. Beck writes, Neoliberal ideas of individualization assume that individuals alone can master the whole of their lives, that they derive and renew their capacity for action from within themselves. Talk of the self-entrepreneur makes this clear. Beck, however, is concerned about this growing emphasis on the individual because it conflicts with our everyday experience in which individuals are unmistakably limited by external circumstances and tied to others through work, family and other relations.
Now, just remember that this thing isn't as black as it appeared.
This conflict becomes clear in It's a Wonderful Life when we look at the journeys of George Bailey and his brother Harry. Unlike George, Harry is the one who seems to become the author of his own life and embarks on the traditional hero's journey. He is the one that gets to leave his town to go to college, who becomes a decorated fighter pilot during the Second World War and basically gets to live the life that George dreamed of. Here we begin to see the negative consequences of neoliberal individualism. By assuming the individual as self-reliant, every failure becomes a personal failure, every dream left unfulfilled becomes a painful emptiness. Even though George ends up marrying the girl he loves, in his perception he is a failure. He didn't get to be what he wanted to be and ends up staying in Bedford Falls where he struggles to preserve himself, his family business and his community against Mr. Potter, a greedy banker who wants to take over Bedford Falls and constantly forces George to make sacrifices for the sake of his fellow citizens.
Just remember this, Mr. Potter, that this rabble you're talking about, they do most of the working and paying and living and dying in this community. Well, is it too much to have them work and pay and live and die in a couple of decent rooms and a bath?
Mr. Potter personifies a truly corrupted version of individualism. His ambition consists of an insatiable hunger for more, a relentless pursuit of selfish desires that leave no room for community, selflessness and kindness.
Can't do that. These families have children.
They're not my children.
But they're somebody's children, Mr. Potter.
Are you running a business or a charity war?
Well, all
Not with my money.
To Mr. Potter, compassion is a weakness, and men like George Bailey are pathetic, naive, and soon to be devoured. Indeed, it seems that for every act of self-sacrifice, George ends up being punished, eventually leading him into desperation. What can be observed here are two attacks on our self-worth, which seems to have become more relevant today than ever. On the one hand, there is the encouragement to become the author of your own life. We can see this today in the increasing importance of using social media to turn your life into an adventurous story, in finding ever more elaborate ways to stand out for a job application, and turning to self-help books and spiritual gurus to become the ultimate master of self-actualization. All this isn't an issue when we are successful, but when we're not, it can be damaging to our self-worth, as the blame for this often falls on ourselves. On the other hand, there is the discouragement to be a member of a community, to act selflessly and compassionately for the sake of others. This we find in the rise of neoliberalism that promises personal freedom and opportunities for all, but which in reality only seems to be true for the Mr. Potters of the world, whose greed has increasingly molded our economy and society to favor their own profits at the expense of others. It has created a climate where might is right, and to quote Father Gabriel from the film The Mission, if might is right, then love has no place in the world.
And did you put the envelope in your pocket?
Yeah,
All right.
no, maybe.
Maybe, I don't want any maybe. We've got to find that money.
Towards the end of It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey's uncle loses $8,000 of the family business, which he intended to deposit at the bank. The money is found by Mr. Potter, who hides it, and as a result, George faces jail time for fraud. In his desperation, George turns to Mr. Potter, who shows no sympathy and points out that because of his life insurance, George is worth more dead than alive. Being at the end of his rope, George starts praying for guidance and contemplates suicide. This, finally, is where he meets Clarence.
Well, who are you then?
Clarence Oddbody, AS2.
Oddbody. AS2, what's that AS2?
Angel, second class.
George laments to Clarence that everyone would have been much better off had he never been born, and Clarence shows him exactly that. In a world without George Bailey, Bedford Falls has fallen into the hands of Mr. Potter. His brother Harry has long since passed away because George was not there to save him when he fell into a frozen lake as a child. His wife Mary ends up alone and his children never came into existence. The experience gives George a newfound appreciation for his life and begs Clarence to bring him back.
Help me, Clarence, please. Please. I want to live again.
His wish is granted, and upon returning to life, George rushes home to embrace his wife and children like never before. At the same time, the citizens of Bedford Falls come to George's aid, having collected enough money to pay off his debt. All ends well, it seems, but it is important to remember that despite the grand gesture of selflessness from his community, for George this is not a definitive victory. The missing money has been replaced, but it's just another battle barely won in the ongoing struggle against Mr. Potter, who has not been defeated or reconciled with. What I like about this is that it doesn't trivialize George's situation, and by extension the very real issue of the Mr. Potters in today's society, draining the world of hope, kindness and compassion for their selfish desires. What I do think is important here, which the ending shows in an exaggerated manner, is that it is not so much George's reality but rather his attitude which has changed. Clarence showed the impact of George's selflessness on his community, but when we look at the entire story again with this same awareness, we discover that his community has also done plenty for him. When George is planning for his travels, his old boss Mr. Gower helps him by buying him a suitcase.
What's my name doing out here?
Little present from old man Gower. Came down and picked it out himself.
He did? What do you know about that? My old boss. Isn't that nice?
When George sacrifices his honeymoon to help out his fellow citizens who are in financial trouble because of Mr. Potter, they go through a lot of effort in the pouring rain to give George a honeymoon after all. And when George finds himself in his darkest hour, the prayers of the entire town summon the angel Clarence from the heavens and save his life.
Looks like we'll have to send someone down. A lot of people asking for help for a man named George Bailey.
So I believe that in the end, George comes to acknowledge not only the impact of his own goodness, but realizes that it's there in everyone else as well. And that truly makes him the richest man in town.
Good idea, Ernie. A toast to my big brother George, the richest man in town.
Clarence really only reveals what was there all along. Yes, it is important to have dreams, but it's also important to not punish ourselves if our lives do not become the perfect adventures that so much of our society expects them to be. This might not sound very inspirational, but maybe that's why It's a Wonderful Life is still so relevant today. It breaks the illusion that we are and should be the absolute masters of our own destinies, that we are all on our own. It shows how deeply our lives are intertwined with each other, how others can cause us misery, but also how they can fill our lives with joy and happiness. It shows that we can find meaning in helping others and sacrificing for them. But more importantly, it shows the importance of acknowledging those who have sacrificed for us. Because above all, I believe that It's a Wonderful Life asks us to find the George Baileys in our lives, those who have made our lives more meaningful, who have helped us in times of need, and be kind to them. The world reflects what we project onto it. If we let ourselves become cold and cynical, the world will respond in kind. But if we look for goodness and compassion, we will find that it's there too.
I want to put into your heads that the world is not all evil. Yes, we do have nightmares, but we also have dreams. We do have villainy, but we also have great compassion among ourselves. That's all I'm here for, I really. Trying to tell you that there's good in the world and that it's wonderful.